Hello, I'm Joanne Clarke. I'm a professor of archaeology at the University of East Anglia and a specialist in heritage and climate change, particularly on the African continent. I'm going to talk briefly today about the impacts of extreme seas, that is, sea level rise and coastal erosion, on heritage sites in Africa. So, the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change is virtually certain that global mean sea level is not only rising, it is accelerating. The sum of glacier and ice sheet contributions is now the dominant source of global mean sea level rise. Observations from tide gauges show an increase from 1.4 millimetres per year between 1901 and 1990 to around 3.6 millimetres per year during the period of 2006 to 2015. The IPCC say that at the century scale and without adaptation, the vast majority of low-lying islands, coasts and communities face substantial risk, whether they are urban or rural, continental or island, at any latitude and irrespective of their level of development. Sea level rise is not globally uniform, however. Various ocean dynamics and terrestrial ice loss generate regional departures of around 30% around the global mean sea level rise. For example, subsidence caused by human activity is currently the most important cause of relative sea level rise change in many delta regions of the world. At the coast, local sea level change is additionally affected by wave run-up, tidal level, wind forcing, sea level pressure, dominant modes of climate variability, seasonal climate periodicities, ocean weather patterns known as mesoscale eddies, changes in river flow, and anthropogenic subsidence. These local contributions, combined with storm surges and tides, result in extreme sea levels, which last for a short time and contrast with the gradual increase in sea level rise over time. Future rise in global mean sea level caused by thermal expansion, melting of glaciers and ice sheets, and land water storage changes is strongly dependent on which degree of warming is calculated. Degrees of warming are based around greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere. This is not emissions. In simple terms, the higher the concentration of greenhouse gases, the faster the planet reaches a 2-degree or 3-degree rise in average global temperature. The Paris Agreement pledged to limit global warming to below 2 degrees, but many climate scientists already believe that target has been breached, and so the next IPCC assessment report has introduced further degrees of warming, including 3 degrees as an example of a more likely scenario. Importantly, sea level rise at the end of the century is projected to be faster under all degrees of warming, including those compatible with achieving the long-term temperature goal as set out by the Paris Agreement. By 2100, global mean sea level will rise between half a metre under a low 1.5 degrees of warming and up to a metre under 3 degrees of warming. There are two forms of coastal damage attributed to climate change-induced seas: coastal flooding and coastal erosion. Coastal erosion in urban regions, at least, is most damaging, but hard to pin on climate change alone, as there are often numerous anthropogenic factors that can exacerbate climate-related extreme seas. So this slide shows you Fort Princeton, one of the 23 castles and forts that comprise the World Heritage Site number 34 along the Ghanaian coastline. In the last 50 years, since 1970, the fort has been badly damaged on its sea facade by coastal erosion from storm surges, yet it is also in disrepair due to neglect. What is more, the coastal erosion that has led to the damage to its facade is almost entirely due to human intervention to do with damming of the Volta River. Engineers have identified a number of anthropogenic changes that they suggest have led to extreme erosion. These include reduced sediment discharge from the Volta River due to the damming at Okosombo, subsidence arising from the reduced sediment supply, beach sand mining, and ironically, the construction of sea defence structures to manage erosion in Quetta and Ada using groins. What this demonstrates is that the causes of coastal erosion are complex and context specific. 3 points to bear in mind here. are that some of the worst instances of loss and damage to heritage from sea level rise and coastal erosion may have very little to do with climate change. Instead, climate change is more likely to exacerbate loss and damage to already vulnerable heritage, and that mitigation strategies, often with the best intentions in mind, can lead to shoreline retreat, and something I want to return to. A recent study of 398 heritage sites in 37 countries across the African continent at risks of the impacts of extreme seas due to climate change showed that 69% of natural heritage sites and 50% of cultural heritage sites will be affected by rising seas by 2030 under a no-change scenario, i.e. under a warming scenario of 1.5 degrees. This research, conducted by myself and colleagues, show that the impacts of sea level rise and coastal erosion will happen across the entire African coastline, and that the threat is not 30 years away or 50 years away, but is happening this decade. Not only is it crucial that we identify and quantify threats, adaptation and mitigation plans need to be implemented before the damage is irreversible. A diversity of adaptation responses to coastal impacts and risks have already been implemented around the African continent, but mostly this has been a reaction to current coastal risk experienced as disasters such as the floods in Grand-Bassam or the coastal erosion of the Ghanaian coast. Hard coastal protection measures such as groins, seawalls and surge barriers are widespread, but often they exacerbate a problem by simply pushing it down the coast and creating a threat somewhere else. One of the most effective adaptation measures is the ability of ecological systems to act as sea defences by stabilising shorelines, but the time it takes to establish natural barriers can be wiped out by the frequency of extreme events. Importantly, effective responses need to be context-specific and tailor-made using an appropriate mix of measures implemented over time as sea levels rise. As a recent report by the IPCC on coastal threats point out, designing and implementing an appropriate mix of responses is not only a technical task, but also a political and value-laden social choice that involves trade-offs between multiple values, goals, and interests. The IPCC lists 5 responses to sea level rise: protection, accommodation, advance, retreat, as the 5. But cultural heritage comes with its own set of limitations and vulnerabilities, which means that many of the responses that can be taken are simply not feasible for heritage. So the objective should be to take measures now while there is still time, and time is the principal disruptor to adaptation. So if we're talking about adaptation, what we need to think about is taking action now with the long term in mind, avoiding new development commitments in high-risk locations, social learning, experimentation and innovation to inform technical solutions, to build shared understanding and develop locally appropriate sea level rise responses, to recognise the political nature of adaptation and to explicitly address vulnerability and equity implications to achieve enduring enabling impact responses, to focus on enabling community capabilities for responding to sea level rise and, where necessary, complementing community knowledge, skills and resources, to involve stakeholders early and consistently throughout decision-making and implementation of SLR responses, and to draw upon multiple knowledge systems to co-design and co-produce sea level rise responses. I hope this has been helpful, and thank you very much for listening.